Welcome to Foodlands, a limited series exploring the ways what we eat and how we eat decides what survives alongside us on our planet. The value that we place on non-human life and systems, and whether we'll be able to feed the future more sustainably. If you already know a lot about these issues and want to cut straight to the chase and hear from our knowledgeable guests, please skip ahead.
If you want to know more about us as hosts and get a journalistic whistle-stop tour of the big questions and what's coming up on the series, keep listening. Thank you for being with us.
Hey everyone, I'm Theo.
And I'm Alex, and we're the hosts of Prophets, Wizards, and the Quest to Value Nature.
Alex recently graduated from an MA in Environmental History. She's been involved in radio for a while and enjoys sharing different people's perspectives on things. You did spend a bit of time discussing tricky topics with politicians on an early morning French breakfast show, is that right?
Au sommaire de cette édition, vous l'avez peut-être entendu, Laurent Wauquiez quitte la
Yeah, that's completely right. The timings have been a little bit more civilized for this project, I must admit. I'm an hour ahead of the UK here in Brittany.
Yeah, I have to admit, also, I've been jealous of that on some of these dark winter mornings where we've headed straight into deep conversations with experts on these issues. Just before we started this series, Foodlands, you had been developing your own expertise on these issues because you just finished a thesis working with older farmers in France to understand through research how they've experienced the industrialization of agriculture.
That's right. So I was really in the zone, ready for the big historical questions we're asking. What does the future of our food systems look like? What biodiversity will still exist? But also, I'm super aware of how important and interesting it is finding out about experiences on the ground. You've also interviewed people working in different parts of our food system while producing media for projects exploring how we transition towards sustainability. And you're a filmmaker based out of a rural place, Cumbria, in northern England, like this little corner of Brittany where I live. You're also a recent humanities graduate.
I studied English literature, and as you know, I did manage to sneak some poetry into one episode of the series. But having heard our bios, we should promise listeners that scientists and experts on the ground are leading the conversations, and we've also got them to check our facts, some of which, at this point, I kind of wish were works of fiction. We're recording this intro at the end of several months of researching and interviewing a few days a week for the series. What are some of those big scary facts that have stuck with you? What facts are still running through your head?
I still remember a fact that Professor Mark Maslin from the University College London mentioned to us, and it's a fact about overall species loss. If you imagine, and I know that you would imagine something like that, Theo, if you imagine that you weighed all of the animals and humans on Earth, the current weight of all land mammals in the world is made up of 30% humans, 67% livestock, and 3% wild animals. 10,000 years ago, wild animals made up 99.95% of that weight.
Yeah, that really puts things into perspective. And there's so many other facts that I love from Mark's book. Another one that I couldn't get out of my head was that we move more soil and rock each year than all of nature's processes combined, which feels crazy to me when we imagine the scale of nature at work. But the impact all that changing of landscapes is having is interesting, isn't it, when it comes to biodiversity and sustainability?
Yes, there's a report from the British Royal Society that we came across while doing research that's really stuck with me as a historian. It basically outlines how the global food system is the single greatest threat to non-human life on Earth. And it's been this way for a while. For a millennia, in fact. Starting with the Pleistocene extinctions and continuing with the overharvesting to extinction of many ancient species like the great auk, and accelerating with 20th century habitat destruction as we know it. Today, the global food system threatens more species than any other area of human activity through habitat destruction to create new farmland, overexploitation of marine and terrestrial species, and agricultural pollution. For comparison, other causes of land clearing, such as urbanization, also pose threats, but have a global footprint less than 1/25th that of agriculture.
Yeah, being hungry for food means being hungry for land. And I sometimes wonder, you were teasing me about my imagination, but I sometimes wonder if we all imagined when we ate processed food that we were taking mouthfuls and mouthfuls of soil.
Hey, this tastes like dirt!
It might help us to get to grips with these impacts our food system has on the planet.
You know what? That might actually make these realizations sit much heavier in our stomachs. But some people listening may be thinking, hang on a second, feeding people should always be more important than protecting wildlife? I think we should say here that we don't need more land to produce more food. We produce enough food to feed the world already. It's just a matter of whose cupboards and whose rubbish bins it ends up in.
Yeah, and this hunger for land, it's not only costing us biodiversity, but also the sustainability of the ecosystems and the natural cycles that all that biodiversity helps support. And that's at a time when climate change is becoming an increasing threat. I've asked you for the facts that have been keeping you up at night, but facts that have stuck in my head about climate change in the last few weeks. Agriculture as a form of land use covers huge swathes of our planet. Only 5% of our ecosystems count as wild, as ecologically sound. But at the same time, 33% of the world's farmland is badly or very badly degraded. This is scary to me. It just makes me start picturing Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar. You know those scenes where they're desperately trying to grow one monocrop of corn.
Okra this year. Now there's just corn. And we're growing more than we ever have. Well, but like the potatoes in Ireland and the wheat in the Dust Bowl, the corn will die.
I think that is a great depiction of what completely degraded farmland looks like. And right now, we've been hearing that this kind of degradation is affecting dryland areas, which are already vulnerable to climate change. You know, it's threatening people's livelihoods right now and the long-term health of these ecosystems. And globally, in that context, the food system is already contributing a huge amount to the causes of climate change. You know, it's contributing a third of greenhouse gas emissions to climate change. So those are the facts that are keeping me up at night. But when we were talking to people for the podcast, we didn't want to always be down and bringing people down. We didn't want to be all doom and gloom. You were always saying, I should smile more with my voice, but how do we not be doom and gloom about this? What did we want to find out from people?
No, that's right. We really wanted to hear about the different challenges, but also about how people are thinking through and working towards clever solutions. At the end of the day, it all does come down to food, and that's why we decided on Foodlands for the title of this series. Because for many of us who are living particularly in cities and bigger towns, that's the only way that we are connected to these impacts that we have on nature in rural places, and more generally on the natural systems that support our very lives. I'm also glad you mentioned dry areas, as we should let listeners know that we could only cover the global north, and particularly the EU, the UK, and North America in these episodes. So the driest things that we get to is southern Spain. The global south deserves a whole series of its own. But having conversations about these issues with knowledgeable people from across Europe, the UK, and the USA really demonstrated to us that there is a spectrum of proposed solutions. On one end, you have prophets who believe we need to radically change our behaviors and our value systems. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the innovating wizards who think we can design our way out of the environmental crisis and that we should value things differently, but within the systems that we have today. Our first guest on the pod is the science writer Charles Mann, and he came up with these categories. I mean, he literally wrote a book on them.
How are we doing? No. By that I meant, how are we, Homo sapiens we, doing as a species?
So it was really a privilege to talk to him and get his blessing for us to borrow his terminology.
100% yes, because it gets into some of the history of how our food system has developed and how all these great incentives over time, the demand that the growing global population has placed on our food system, have become increasingly damaging to our environment today. We call this episode Farming Everything All the Time for a reason, because we often think that farmers just farm food, right? You know, you go to a farm, you're taught as a kid, farmers farm food, but they're involved in managing all the nature and the natural systems in their landscapes. Effectively, on a farm, they're farming everything on their land, not just those aspects of it that are actually going to end up on people's tables. So, it's sort of ironic that the food system, in a kind of sad way, poses such a threat to biodiversity, because for us, Earth biodiversity is the source of the thousands of species of plants, animals, and of fungi that form our food supply, right? And I think what your interview with Charles Mann does is it gives such a great overview of the unintended consequences that can come from these good intentions to produce food more efficiently, when it's really hard not to impact everything else in the environment.
Yeah, you're right. Charles Mann, as a viral TED speaker and best-selling author, really did bring the history and future of these questions alive. So we hope you enjoy listening to him, and we'll see you on the other side.
When you go to school, you don't learn anything about agriculture. You don't learn anything about agricultural history. You don't learn anything, they don't teach you anything to contextualize the food that you're eating. How is it that these lunches came to you? And it's not, I think the academic word is problematized at all, or even the basic knowledge confirmed. I mean, it's really striking that, when I wrote this book, The Wizard and the Prophet, the one that you're alluding to, in part, it's a biography of a man named Norman Borlaug, who is, very likely a candidate for the most important person who lived in the 20th century. I mean, when I give talks both in Europe and North America, I often begin by saying, how many people know who Norman Borlaug is? And there's always, like the one or two wise guys who raise their hands, right? But basically nobody knows. And the reason they should know is that Borlaug is a central figure in what's been called the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is the combination of high-yielding seeds, high-intensity agriculture, and high-throughput irrigation that was put together in the middle of the 20th century and was responsible for doubling, tripling, even quadrupling the world's harvest of wheat, rice, and to a lesser extent, maize. In the 1960s, it was quite common to believe the world was heading towards this terrible crash, that there was going to be, a population bomb, that hundreds of millions of people would die of starvation in the 1970s and 1980s because the world's population was increasing so much. 40% of the world already lived in, what they call the state of food insecurity, where they, simply didn't know whether they were going to be able to feed themselves all through the year. And today, there is twice as many people as there were before, and yet about 7-8% of the world lives in a state of food insecurity. It's just an enormous change that underlies so many other changes in the world, and it was catalyzed by this guy named Norman Borlaug, who is sort of the patron saint of the wizards.
It's a real honor to have you on the show because we based almost our entire podcast on this. How did you come to finding these categories useful in order to decode where we're at in facing the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis? How did it occur to you that these were useful models to look at the divides in the responses in the scientific community?
I've been covering issues of the environment in particular since the mid-1980s. During that time, I've talked to a lot of scientists, politicians, activists, people of all sorts. And gradually I realized that when I would ask questions about, what we should do about this or that environmental problem, the answers I got fell into what I came to think of as sort of two broad categories. They're like, either ends of a continuum. In my mind, I started calling them wizards and prophets. And wizards are people basically who think that science and technology, properly applied, will let us produce our way out of our problems. How are we going to feed the world? Well, that's going to be through GMOs to produce these sort of hyper-productive plants. How are we going to get enough water for everybody? We're going to need, very large and advanced desalination projects, and that kind of thing. And the prophets, on the other hand, tend to be animated by the idea that the world has these ecological limits that we pass, to our peril. that is extremely dangerous to pass. There's these sort of planetary boundaries where we have a carrying capacity. There's a whole bunch of different names for that. And they tend to use, the answer is to use less, to consume less, to reduce our footprint. And so the question for them is, what are we going to do for energy or climate? It's, very much we're going to have small scale renewables. What are we going to do for food? We're going to eat lower on the food chain, reduce the footprint of agriculture, be more attentive to the soil through, organic methods and that kind of thing. What are we going to do for water? We're going to reduce our demand for water by, instead of having lawns and, bright green things in deserts, we're going to have what they call xeriscaping, which is using, the plants in the landscape that they evolved in. And if you think about it, these answers are kind of the opposite of each other. One is saying, more, and the other one is saying less. These are the kinds of arguments that on one level are about, practical issues like, can we make enough nuclear power plants? Should we make enough nuclear power plants? Can we make enough solar plants or wind plants? But on another level, really about values. They're really about the kind of world that we want to live in tomorrow. And many of the prophets want to see, if you like, a much more community-oriented, democratized, small-scale way of life that emphasizes, the ties between people, the ties between communities, and our connections to the land. And many of the wizards, on the other hand, typically want to see something that they view as maximizing human potential, as making it possible for everybody to live as well as they possibly can. And they typically want to see everybody in cities, which they see as a place where people are most free to be what they are, and to then have all outside the cities kind of, untouched nature. And so these are much more about values than they are about, something that's, really actually, practical or pragmatic. And one of the reasons that there's been so much conflict between these, because there has been an enormous amount of conflict between the wizards and prophets, is that they are really about a clash of values and about different visions of what tomorrow will look like.
Yeah, and that's what I found really, really striking when I went into the field of agricultural history, was that agriculture and visions of agriculture in every different day and age kind of represented different visions of what progress was, or what modernity was, or what even the good life in the broader sense was meant to be. And the role that was assigned to the farmer really kind of reflected these values in society. The good farmer always embodied that new vision. And for this season, we're actually really looking at the rural space in general, and basically what different visions of the future of agriculture are making of this rural space. It's almost visual, the difference between prophets and wizards, because wizards really, as you said, they picture like an emptying of the rural space, sometimes like even a rewilding or like a wilding, and incredibly efficient cities and agricultural systems. And then on the other hand, it feels like prophets might be the ones imagining a very inhabited rural space with very like entangled relationships. Do you think that farming is one of those key places where there's a huge divergence between prophets and wizard?
Oh, absolutely. And you captured an awful lot of it just a moment ago. The wizards, tend to prize efficiency, and in their view, and productivity. And the way to do that is to have these giant farms, typically with huge pieces of farm machinery on them and very, very few people. And so then those people who would have been working on the farm are freed up to do, quote unquote, more productive work, probably in the cities. And in fact, that's been the agricultural policy of most of the nations in Europe and the Americas and throughout much of the world for the last 30 or 40 years, which is to create incentives to remove people who are seen as unproductive from the countryside and put them into the cities where they can work in factories or in media or whatever, and have essentially giant, open spaces that are tended essentially by robots, is where they're heading. It's had tremendous positive and negative effects. And the positive effects is that it is truly efficient and productive, and they've been able to produce more calories per hectare than you could have possibly have imagined 100 years ago. The negative social effects is that it's hollowed out rural communities around the world. And that's part of the reason that you're seeing this kind of populist movement, as these very damaged communities in rural areas are seeking to rectify their situation. And it's a big issue, both in the United States, as you probably have read in the newspapers, and I know in Europe. The Gilets jaunes and the Trump voter are not completely unrelated.
Absolutely. And we're also finding that they hollowed the rural world out of a lot of its biodiversity and of its soil biodiversity.
Again, this efficiency and simplification in the idea that, if you're going for maximum productivity, the maximum number of calories per hectare that is produced as inexpensively as possible, you want to produce a single variety of a single crop so that you can optimize your processing equipment for that single variety of a single crop. If you have a dozen different varieties of maize, for example, the cobs are all different sizes, the plants mature at different times, so it becomes much more complicated to process it. Whereas if you grow a single variety that's basically clones, they all ripen at the same time. You can send in a giant machine, get them all. You know exactly how big the cobs are, so you can optimize your equipment to process cobs for that. You know exactly the strength and color and all that of the kernels. And so you end up radically reducing the amount of agricultural biodiversity. And on top of that, you have this idea that was really from the German scientist Liebig back in the 19th century, in that the soil is a kind of medium, like a growth medium, like a petri dish. And you essentially put in the right kinds of chemicals, and then the crops will grow. And you put in the right type of fertilizer and the water in the proper way and the right type of pesticides. And so instead, the other version is that you have this soil microbiome and these sort of naturally occurring minerals in the soil, and you try to foster this natural balance. The wizards say, why should you go through such complexity? We know what it takes to make plants grow. Let's just put it in the soil and not have to worry about these things. And that's a little bit of a cartoon that I'm giving, but that's essentially the thrust of the idea, is that you have this radically simplified, emptied, super productive, hyper efficient landscape versus something that's much more complicated and much more labor intensive.
As we're facing this biodiversity loss crisis, don't you think that even the wizards who are working in the agricultural field today are concerned by soil quality?
You'll talk to people in the large, agricultural firms. What they would like to do is say, okay, you're right. We need to have, this right collection of microorganisms, of bacteria and fungi particularly. And so we can make a soup and, you can spray it on the soil and produce the right the environment. And you can also map each field very, very precisely with GPSs, and you can see that you can catch each tiny microclimate, and you can adapt the planting to that with these large scale use of computers and drones and so forth. And so, as far as the different varieties, that's why we're building lots and lots of these giant freezers, like the one in Svalbard, where we're keeping tens of thousands of different varieties. And when we have a problem that needs to be solved by some new genetic material, we will just go to the freezer and pull it out and so forth. And so that's their solution, which is of course very, very different from what the prophets envision, which is keeping that biodiversity there to begin with. In the far northwest of Mexico, a combination of the Spanish influence and indigenous influence has created these sort of what they call silvopastoral systems, in which you have a variety of tree crops and then cattle underneath them grazing, and sometimes pigs, and you end up with a pretty diverse system that uses much, much less water than you would use if you were growing wheat there or something. And so in areas of Spain, south of France, Italy, coasts of the Adriatic, right now they're growing largely cereal crops, and they're starting to run out of water as things get drier. And these kind of silvopastoral systems seem like at least a possibility for something that you could do that would bring back more diversity with much less need for water.
Yeah, and it feels like currently it's quite fashionable for mainstream areas of agroecology and other disciplines to be inspired by the agricultural techniques and tools of indigenous people and like local ecological knowledge to base innovation more and more. And I feel like that might actually be the place where the wizard mindset kind of meets the prophet style mindset, if that makes sense.
I absolutely agree. We've really sort of abandoned the idea of silviculture, quite common in the indigenous Americas, where you have tree crops. One in Europe that springs to mind is the chestnut. Chestnuts were, up until the 14th or 15th centuries, a main source of protein for lots and lots of Europeans, particularly in places like Italy. And they use less water, use less labor, use less fertilizer. They're sort of there. And you can grow your wheat and so forth, but you could always know that there was this backup crop. And they're not typically grown now because they're, in early 20th century, the prospects of mechanizing the harvest of chestnuts was very limited, and they focused on crops that you could be mechanically harvested, like the cereals, like wheat and barley and so forth. But we have much better technology now, and I don't think that taking a look at tree crops, which would also help with carbon sequestration and water issues, would be such a foolish idea. I just feel like there's many more creative approaches that we can do that typically get locked out of discussions like this.
Yeah, I'm like still digesting that about silviculture. It's like very appealing and really reminds me of walnut agriculture in the southeast of France in the mountains. Although they've brought that to a very extreme monoculture kind of approach. So they still haven't struck that balance. I feel like there's a lot in there, and I hear you kind of leaning, you're definitely not sounding like an eco-modernist when you speak about these things. It sounds like, this idea, especially in Europe, of inhabited landscapes, where like quite an important workforce is entangled in the natural world and then works with it to make life possible. I think that what really comes up if we talk about inviting silvopastoral techniques into the European space, one thing we really have to think about is our definitions of nature. Like where and when do these date from? Because in a way, we've always been impacting nature, but the landscapes that are our contemporary agricultural landscapes, I feel like Europeans often consider them as timeless, as if they preceded any kind of agricultural history. And so that would, what you're suggesting would mean completely changing the kinds of landscapes that surround us.
Yes, and that's one thing that, this is one area that I think that both the wizards and prophets have trouble with. Wizards have this, preference for simple and efficient, and this is not simple. This is very complex. But there's not. That's just a value judgment, right? It's we like simple because it's clean, but that isn't really a scientific. And similarly, the prophets have a real reverence for tradition, but again, in the time worn and the things that we've done in the past. But again, that's not a quote unquote scientific attitude. That's just that's a moral and spiritual preference. And so you can be I would argue that you could where they could meet is something like this, in which the prophets would have to accept radical change and the wizards would have to accept complexity. What
I'm seeing emerging in response to the environmental crisis in our agroecosystems is basically incentives so that we have blended approach between profits and wizards. For instance, biodiversity sensitive approaches to farming without necessarily prescribing it to be industrial or very small scale. Do you think that these kinds of approaches could work?
Yes, they could. I mean, these things are not possible without some kind of values and without some kind of idea of where you're heading. You know, there's a thing that, we'll provide an equal playing field and the market will decide, that kind of argument, but it's extraordinarily rare that actually works out in practice. And so I think that if there could be, in an ideal system, you'd have a debate, a discussion. Both of these have real virtues. The virtue of productivity should not be ignored, but also the virtue of protecting biodiversity should not be ignored.
But you actually think that they could coexist in the same space, that they're not just going to keep on going in their silos, and that, sometimes I just picture a European land with just islands of profits, like a little archipelago of profits, in a very wide expanse of industrial agriculture. I think about it this way. Do you think that they can share this space?
Yeah. We're talking about human systems and human ideas, right? It's not like physical laws. So, almost anything is possible. The question is, how likely is it? At the moment, I guess I'm sort of weirdly optimistic in the sense that climate change, in particular, is going to force us to do things in a very different way. Keeping as we've been doing things just doesn't seem like an option. Some of the things that are going on in the United States are examples of this, and I'm sure that there are examples also in Europe. In the United States, one of the things that everybody has agreed on is not to give Native people any power, right? To suppress them, and that's policy that's going on for a couple of centuries. Well, about 3 months ago, California just passed a law. California, the state that had begun with the largest massacre of Native people in North America, that's literally was created on the bodies of Native people, just passed a law that gives Native people the right to burn preventively, large areas in Northern California. That gives them real authority. It's brand new law. We'll have to see how it works out, but this would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. And it's because the giant fires have forced people to realizing that they're going to have to do things differently. I'm sure you have the equivalents of things in Europe. Surely those floods in Germany that happened this summer are provoking some thought about what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that energy of hope, when you think about the future of the rural world, do you get a picture in your head? Do you see a landscape?
Me? Yeah, but it's just my personal preference, right? I could see lots of different types of landscapes. I think because of the uncertainties of climate change, any system that you have, whether wizards or profits, is going to involve much more diverse agriculture. But the world is big enough that you could have, as you say, giant industrialized plots of walnut trees as part of it. I live in the countryside, like seeing all the jungly stuff around. So personally, I lean towards more on that particular side, more of the profits. But as a journalist, I hope I'm honest enough to say that I think the other side could work. That it wouldn't lead to disaster. It just wouldn't be my preference.
I love that. I think I've kind of come around the same way. I have, for having lived in the rural space for a while. I do prefer the kind of more traditionalist just relationship with the natural world, but I have to admit that now that I've been talking to more wizardry, they seem to have a coherent plan for how industrial scale would work.
It could work. The question is whether you'd want it. I think that's a really vital question. One of the things that is sort of consistent with politics all over the world is that as cities have become more and more important, demographically, and as more and more people have poured into the cities, the countryside has been neglected. And that's true, even in places like India and China, where the governments, are so recently descended from rural movements. And the great problem is that the cities are directly connected to the countryside, right? That we have this idea that if we're in the middle of Brussels, we're not, or Paris or Sao Paulo, we're not connected to the countryside, and that's completely wrong. I mean, that's where your food comes from, where your water comes from, where all the things that are inputs into the city come from, and the city has an enormous footprint outside of itself, ranging from the food it consumes and the water to the enormous number of second houses by wealthy urban people. And so that because our politics is myopic in this way, we've allowed situations to continue in the countryside that are simply wrong in every way. And this is going to have to, this simply can't continue in my view. And so we're going to have to change it. And either we're going to do it in a wizard way or a prophet way, probably.
I feel like what's really interesting for a lot of our listeners is to really get a sense of how agriculture actually shapes not only biodiversity and what we eat, but also what society looks like.
Sure. Well, if you think back on it, 100, 120 years ago, something like 70% of the workforce was involved in agriculture. And no question about it, that was a really, really hard life. And no question about it also that some of the developments of the 20th century, notably things like tractors, made that life far easier than it had been and far more productive. The question then is, and some of those people are inevitably going to go to the city. So you're going to see some kind of urbanization, as we've seen in the 20th century, sort of no matter what. But the question is how much? And right now in North America, something like 3% of the population is involved in agriculture. It makes a huge difference in a society if 10% or 5% is out in rural areas and 25 or 30%. Yes, the cities are dominant in both cases, but in one case you have a nearly empty countryside, with all the attendant social ills. And in the other, you have a much more full countryside, but it's not clear that the work for those people is going to be good. We have adopted so many policies that make farm work very, very low paying that to refill the countryside as the prophets would like would involve radical transformations of society in such a way that have only been adopted in a few places like Japan, where there are enormous social mechanisms to make rural life more palatable.
Yeah, what I find really interesting about these issues is like living in France, I think, is quite different when you're considering issues related to agriculture and the rural world. And not least because at the end of the 1970s, it was the largest exporter of agricultural goods. Also because what that means, that green revolution was very particular to France, I think. In Europe, coming out of the Second World War, still 36% of French people were working in agricultural fields. And 40% of the French population was living in the rural world. What that means for, I think, young French people today is that 40% of us have grandparents who were farmers. And in France, we still say paysans, peasants. And that creates a really radically different environmental awareness in a way. I studied in the UK and I was part of environmental movements on both sides of the channel. But in France, it's so much about ways of growing your food and food consumption and agriculture and the kinds of farmers that you're supporting. And also like farming subsidies and then on the other side, on the British side, it's so much more about the cities because the supply chains are so much further away. Yeah, it's very wild the way that our agricultural histories kind of shapes our current environmental consciousness.
But strikingly, in both of them, you have real rural discontent, which is manifested sometimes in what seem to me to be self-destructive ways. Even though there's much more concern about the countryside in France, at least at a rhetorical level, there is, the policies in France and Britain for the countryside are not that different because they were the EU policies, right? Both led to a depopulation of the countryside and the adoption, more or less of what was seen as scientific farming. So it's striking that despite this cultural difference, you have this on the ground similarity.
Yeah. How do you think that we help young people kind of create that relationship in their mind between, their environmental ethic and like the entire incredible system that is agri-food system? Like, do you think that there's like a way of like making them feel responsible and making them feel a sense of agency? Or do you think that like it's through communicating about fear?
I guess this leads to the question, how do you motivate people? And, that's a really squishy area of research. And it's also typically the areas in which people think, well, I know what motivates me, and so therefore it must be what motivates everybody. I'm not really sure that that's true. I hope that your viewers will really understand that that if they think that this is ridiculous, then they might be right. But one of the things I've often realized thought about is that without agriculture, everything else falls apart. When you think about it, it's the world's most essential industry. All the fun things that we like to do are great, but they, when it gets right down to it, I think it was Bertolt Brecht who said, first thing you do is feed your face. That's a line from the Three Penny Opera, and it's dead on. And he lists all these things he wants to do, but first feed your face. And that's what Borlaug said. He said, we have 40% of the world that's hungry. That's unacceptable. And we have to do something about it. And extraordinarily, he did. And a whole host of, other people, I should say. He sort of catalyzed it. The biggest change was when he worked on wheat. And when he got his results, people said, wait a minute, we're going to take the same methodology and apply it to rice. And they created this institution called the International Rice Research Institution in the early 1960s. It's in the Philippines. It's one of the most important institutions in the world. And it developed high-yielding rice that now 80% of the rice in Asia is IRRI rice. It was rice developed as on the Borlaug model. And it is part of the reason that, when I was a kid growing up, Asia was the poor part of the world. And now it's definitely not. And Borlaug and the methods he prefers have an enormous amount to do with that. And it's one of these huge historic changes that, basically we're not taught about in school. And I think it's kind of a big error. The most important political act you can do is to vote. And therefore, the best thing that you can do is inform yourself. Because, political scientists say that typically, most people are just sort of concerned with their daily lives, and they, rely on people who they know and trust, who have really looked into something to give them their advice. And you see that in both good and bad ways. You see that with the communities, in my view, bad ways of the vaccine skeptical, which is that it's very much about somebody there who is an assertive person has said, I've looked into it and these vaccines are bad, or what have you. But there's also good impacts of that. And if you are a person who really looks into these questions, and there's plenty of places you can find information. I guess this is the point for me to plug my book. So The Wizard and the Prophet. With them. Sorry, that's right.
Don't worry, I'll plug your book as well.
My publisher would be very happy. Anyway, but there's lots of other sources, trust me. Inform yourself and get people to do it. And the best thing that could happen would for this be on the public plate. It's something that people talk about and think about, because it is absolutely true that political forces, and economic forces have a tremendous amount of power. But they have much less power if public attention is focused on them. Something like we're seeing now with Facebook, which is a hugely powerful company, one of the world's largest, and yet the fact that it's now under the microscope is causing like this earthquake to happen so much that the company is now changing its name. This is really, I think, what needs to happen in a larger way, is to say, what kind of countryside do we want to have? What kind of landscape do we want to live in? And agriculture is a really critical part of that. And we are going to be making decisions that are going to go on and have ramifications for the next century.
Should we decide if we're prophets or wizards, or should we try to still go ahead trying to synthesize both approaches to the way that we approach farming? Or is it a question of like picking a side and then being aware of like the values that you're holding and just opening up to the other side and having discussions?
I guess I would put it this way. It's clear that we're going to have to make some big changes. And right now, different parties are arguing for different things and different ways of making those big changes. Like you say, some are saying the solution is to kind of double down on the old system with even more technology, with AI and GIS and and
Drones.
rapid scanning of the soil microbiome and so forth. And others are in favor of these more complex agricultural systems like the silvopastoral systems that we've been talking about. So I guess you could look at it two ways. One is that this discussion is very healthy and good, and the very sign that we're having it is an indication that things will change, maybe in a more profit-oriented way. The other is to be cynical and say all the big players have in the system have their stakes in the way they were doing something now, and they would want to continue on doing with it. And that's, all these large agribusinesses who actually run the show. So I don't know what the answer is. Each of those seems like a perfectly plausible way to look at it.
Yeah, I completely feel you on that skeptical versus kind of optimistic two ways of looking at it. And kind of the underlying theme that we don't really get to address here is power dynamics behind the prophets and the wizards and the kind of piles of finances that they're respectively sitting on. If you're happy with that, I'm happy to bring this slowly to a close. Where can we learn more about your work and your upcoming books?
So I guess stay tuned.
Okay, we will.
Yeah, I'm working on a book about the North American West, which is where many of these issues that we've been talking about are, showing up in a really urgent form very early. And to some extent, the things that are happening in the North American West now are what, Europe and the eastern part of the United States will be seeing in 20 or 30 years. I will announce it on Twitter.
Fabulous. I just want to thank you for creating a model which allows us to see our silos and to look across them and to really question whether, our groupthink.
Well, thank you. I should say that, the old expression, I forget who it is, that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. I'm very grateful that the model is useful. Most people don't know that there's these sort of fundamental decisions about what the world their kids are going to live in are being made, and they don't know the basis for them, nor do they know really even how important they are. And almost anything that increases public awareness, like your podcast, is a great thing. It should not be something that's restricted to a small group of specialists. This should be really much part of the course of politics. It's totally bad news that the agricultural system, which has led to these social ills, is almost never discussed, on the level of national politics in the United States. I think that's less true in Europe, but it's still more true than it should be.
So here Charles raised loads of the questions and issues that we're considering, from how agricultural development has impacted biodiversity and natural systems, to what we can do about it, how things might change in the future. Agricultural production more than tripled between 1960 and 2015, owing in part to the Green Revolution, those productivity-enhancing technologies. Theo, it's crazy when you think about the ramifications of this change in productivity.
It is crazy. I remember in my research coming across a story that really made me think about what we've discussed about not blaming agriculture and our food system and us as consumers for following the incentives that we have been following. One of the agricultural revolutions I did know about was the Haber process in the early 1900s, which made synthetic nitrogen fertilizer available for the first time. And to put things into perspective, before the Haber process, we were milling bone for fertilizer in the UK and Europe, and that included bone got from Egyptian tombs, and at least a few sources suggest from horses' skeletons dug up from the battlefields of Waterloo, which I shouldn't probably mention because this is an Anglo-French podcast, but which I think really brings home quite how desperate people were and quite what those population pressures on the food system were like.
No, that's right.
It was a huge deal. I mean, today, half of the nitrogen in our bodies is synthetic. But the thing that really interested me is that experts are beginning to think that over the next few decades, the population of the world might level out. You're the historian, but it made me think that we might be entering a new epoch in history at the right time, at the time when we need to stop overclocking these natural systems and just decimating biodiversity. We actually no longer have those population pressures. So, yeah, Charles Mann, I thought, gave us a really good history lesson, brought us up to the present in a sense, and gave us a really good platform on which to look at what's happening now and also what might happen in the future. More technology getting involved in the food system, that potentially means fewer farmers as people continue to move to cities, and it's going to be really interesting to see whether some of the remote working effects of the pandemic stay around and change these trends of who lives in rural places, maybe in a different direction to how things have been going. What's exciting is that the people we talk to in this series, unlike those figures from the past, are actually looking at how biodiversity and natural systems can be made fundamental or at least conserved in the agricultural revolutions that are already underway. Before we talk about the future in the sense of what's coming up on the series, we want to share with you a quick word on our sponsor. The presenting sponsor of the Foodland season is the Framework Project, an EU-funded project helping localities to value biodiversity in our food system. How we value nature and biodiversity in our food system will require major international investment from public and private sources, and it is heading in the right direction. But even so, according to the UN, around 90% of agricultural subsidies still harm the nature that we rely on rather than supporting it. That's something we're getting into in episode 2, right? The financial aspects of all this?
In episode 2, we follow the money. We had to. I mean, that figure of 90% of agricultural subsidies still harming the nature that we rely on, that's crazy. And that is so concrete. So we follow the money and we talk to those working out how we can better value nature, basically, and how we can better value the farmers who value nature, in turn, in our food systems.
In the episodes, we talk to historians, we talk to philosophers, farmers, farmer philosophers, all sorts of people about how we culturally think through our relationship with nature. We get into the viewpoints of different folks in these rural places and more experts about what it's actually like to try and feed the world right now in these changing times of shifting social expectations and these huge environmental concerns that we have. Thinking of huge environmental concerns, where do we end up? Where do we end up on the series? In our final episode.
Theo, it does lead us into our final episode, right? This one is about who gets to decide where things go next. You know, as a generation of farmers change over in Europe, the UK and North America right now, and machine learning and robotics is on the rise, what does all this mean for the biodiversity and natural systems involved in feeding us all? Will this technological progress allow us to produce food with less damage to the land we have? Or move more of agriculture into labs and cities? And is it a simple choice between these things?
Having worked on the series together, There are often no simple choices, and there's still a lot that we need to find out, but what we do know is globally there are very few opportunities remaining for further expanding the foodlands where we grow our food. Much of the land available to us is no longer suitable for agriculture, and bringing that land into production would carry huge environmental, social and economic costs that I think we just wouldn't want to bear. And the different guests we've had potentially are thinking in a more similar way than maybe our listeners and maybe us going in expected.
That's right. I mean, we talked to folks from businesses, but also from university common rooms, and from hippie communes, but also from the ground, simply people who work in farming every day. And they were all saying the same thing, that biodiversity is vital for our food system in all sorts of areas. I mean, from controlling food crop pathogens with genetic diversity, all the way to maintaining yields with pollination and adapting to climate change. It was everything, and it was also about beautiful landscapes.
Yeah, and I think if you care about the food on your table, how we deal with environmental crises and how they play out in our rural areas, I think, yeah, this series is worth your time.
Yeah, we really look forward to you joining us.
Our show is a podcast from Tascape Media, hosted by Alexandra George-Pico, who's also an assistant producer, and Theodore Simmons, who produces and edits the series. The production assistant is me, Beatrix Keeler. Alistair Simmons is our executive producer. Our thanks to all who've been involved in making the show possible.